All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a true crime story that chilled Chicago to its core back in 1956, the Grimes sisters.
Ugh.
And trust me, this isn't just a rehash of the same old facts. We're going way deeper, unraveling the controversies, the conflicting reports, the lingering questions that make this case so fascinating.
Yeah, this case really captures a specific moment in American history. We'll be looking at how the social and cultural landscape of the 1950s shaped the investigation and how those factors still fuel theories today.
So picture this, December 28th, 1956, a Friday night Chicago. Think bustling streets, that holiday buzz, and Elvis Presley, king of rock and roll, blasting from every jukebox. That's the world 15-year-old Barbara Grimes and her 12-year-old sister Patricia were living in. Typical teenagers, huge Elvis fans, heading out to see Love Me Tender, get this, for the 11th time. 11.
Wow, 11 times. That really shows you just how big Elvis was, especially for teenage girls.
Yeah, he was the heartthrob. And it's their Elvis obsession that leads them to the Brighton Theater that night. Their friend Dorothy Wienert saw them in line for popcorn, excited, just being kids. And that's the last confirmed sighting of them alive. That little detail is so important.
It is, yeah. It sets the baseline, right? Helps investigators, even all these years later, figure out what could have happened.
It's like a snapshot almost.
Yeah.
This ordinary moment, and then poof, everything changes.
Exactly. And that seemingly normal moment launches a mystery. Midnight hits, the movie's over, but Barbara and Patricia, they don't come home. Their mom, Loretta, she even sends the other kids to the bus stop, thinking maybe they just missed their ride. But nothing.
I can't even imagine the panic. So the family reports them missing, and then boom, the search just blows up. Hundreds of officers, volunteers, they're combing the city, dredging rivers. All of Chicago is fixated on this.
And you have to remember, this was a different time. Something like this, two young girls vanishing, it wasn't something you heard about every day. Not like today with constant news and social media. So when it happened, it really shook people up.
It really shattered that feeling of safety, huh? So what was everyone thinking? Did they think the girls ran away? I mean, the whole Elvis thing, maybe they took off to try and find him.
Yeah, that runaway theory was a big one back then.
Hmm.
Elvis was a symbol of, well, rebellion, for teenagers especially. Plus, there were these rumors going around that they'd been spotted in other parts of the city, maybe heading to a concert. Even Elvis himself made a plea for them to come home, which probably just fueled those rumors even more.
Wow, that's wild. So they're searching high and low, chasing down Elvis-related rumors.
Mm.
But what if they didn't run away? What else could have happened? Weeks go by, still no sign of them. And then on January 22nd, 1957, comes this awful discovery. A construction worker, Leonard Prescott. He's driving along a desolate road and spots something flesh-colored. His wife, she even faints when they get a closer look.
It's a chilling image, right? Those flesh-colored objects turned out to be the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, lying there, naked and frozen, on the side of German Church Road, miles from the Brighton Theater. Just devastating. And that's when the missing persons case becomes a possible homicide investigation.
Miles away from the theater. That changes things, doesn't it? What did the scene look like? Could investigators tell what happened?
Well, the location itself was strange. A deserted road, not near any houses or anything. Imagine driving along this quiet, empty stretch, and then there they are.
Awful. And so far from where they were last seen that immediately makes you want to run.
Exactly. It was clear something terrible had happened. Barbara was lying on her side, her legs bent toward her body. Patricia was partially on top of her head turned to the right. Both had bruises, and Barbara had these three almost like ice pick marks on her chest.
Those marks sound pretty suspicious. Were they the cause of death? What did the autopsy show?
Well, this is where things get even more murky. The autopsies, they were done by very experienced pathologists, but even after 5 hours examining each body, they couldn't agree on exactly what caused their deaths.
5 hours each. That's a long time. Must have been a really complicated, confusing case.
It was. The official cause of death was listed as shock and exposure, which, given the freezing temperatures and them being found naked, makes sense. But the contents of their stomachs suggested they died just hours after being at the theater.
Hold on, so they died right after the movie, but are found weeks later, miles away. How?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's haunted this case for decades. The location, their condition, the missing clothes, it all suggests they weren't killed where they were found. That mismatch between the estimated time of death and where and how they were found, it's a huge red flag.
Okay, so we have this strange situation. The girls likely died very soon after the movie, but their bodies turn up weeks later, miles away. and they're naked. It sounds like someone was trying to hide something.
It does, doesn't it? And those missing clothes, that's a detail that really stands out. Were they redressed after death? Was the crime scene staged? It's all part of the puzzle.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole thing about conflicting reports regarding potential sexual assault. Some accounts mention it, some don't. What's the truth?
Well, here's where the historical context is crucial. This was 1956. The way society understood and talked about sexual assault was very different then. It's possible the evidence was overlooked or maybe even intentionally downplayed to protect the girls' reputations or even to shield the public from the more disturbing details.
So we have to remember that what we're reading now, it might not be the complete story because of how things were handled back then.
Exactly. The information available today might be incomplete or even skewed by the social norms of the time. It's a problem historians and investigators run into all the time with older cases.
Speaking of problems, I read that one of the investigators, Harry Gloss, he lost his job for speaking out about this case. What was that about?
Ugh. Harry Glass. He was the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that these girls were murdered. He went against the official autopsy findings, said there were signs of violence on their faces that couldn't be explained by animals after death.
So he's challenging the official story, saying there's more to it. That's a brave move, especially back then.
Very brave. Gloss believed there was a cover-up, that something was off about the official explanation. He also said there was evidence of sexual assault, which contradicted the initial reports.
So he's basically a whistleblower, risking his career to expose the truth as he saw it.
Yeah, you could say that, but his outspokenness made him a controversial figure. And eventually, the coroner dismissed him. Gloss's claims just add another layer of intrigue to this already mysterious case.
It makes you think, what could have been so sensitive about this case that they'd silence an experienced investigator?
That's a great question. And it fuels the theories that there was some kind of effort to suppress certain information. Yeah, it's like two separate puzzles almost.
Yeah.
What happened to the girls right after the movie, and then how do their bodies end up somewhere completely different weeks later?
And like you said before, the missing clothes. That's a big one, right? Makes you wonder if it was intentional.
Right, it could mean a staged crime scene, or maybe they were moved and dressed again after they died. Just makes an already strange case even more complicated.
It's a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces gone. And then on top of that, there are these conflicting stories about possible sexual assault. Some people say it happened, some say it didn't. What's the real story?
Well, you got to think about when this all happened. 1956. Back then, talking about sexual assault, it was a whole different thing. It's possible that evidence was missed or that they deliberately downplayed the details, to protect the girls' reputations, or even to keep the public from hearing the more disturbing parts.
So what we're reading now might not be the whole truth because of how different things were back then.
Exactly. What we know now might be incomplete or even wrong because of the social norms of the time. Happens all the time with these older cases.
Speaking of problems back then, I read that one of the investigators, Harry Gloss, he actually got fired for talking about this case. What happened there?
Oh, Harry Gloss. He was the lead investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office. And he was positive, absolutely sure, that these girls were murdered. He disagreed with the official autopsy report, said there were signs of violence on their faces that couldn't have been caused by animals after they died.
So he's basically saying the official story is wrong, there's more to it. That's pretty risky, especially in those days.
Very risky. Gloss thought there was a cover-up, that something about the explanation didn't add up. He also said there was evidence of sexual assault, which went against what the first report said.
So he's a whistleblower then, risking his job to try and tell the truth.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. But because he was so outspoken, he became controversial. And in the end, the coroner fired him. Gloss's claims, well, they just add another layer to this whole mystery.
It makes you wonder, what could have been so bad about this case that they had to silence an experienced investigator like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it just adds to the idea that someone was trying to hide information about this case.
Okay, so we've got these strange autopsy results, an investigator who gets punished for speaking out, missing clothes. It all seems really suspicious. Did they have any actual suspects back then?
They looked into a few people, but every lead went nowhere. One of the most famous, I guess you could say, was Edward Bedwell. He was a young drifter who looked a lot like Elvis.
The Elvis connection again? It's almost too perfect.
It does seem that way, but Bedwell's looks are just one part of the story. He actually confessed to killing the girls. Said he and someone else picked them up, gave them hot dogs, and then killed them when they turned him down.
Whoa, a confession. Sounds pretty convincing. Case closed, right?
Not quite. Bedwell later said he didn't do it, that the police had forced him to confess. And there were some things that didn't match up, like the autopsies didn't show any signs of them eating hot dogs or drinking alcohol, like he said. And probably the most important part, Bedwell had a solid alibi for the night the girls disappeared. He was working at his job in Cicero.
A false confession. It's crazy how that happens, especially when you have someone who's vulnerable under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, false confessions are more common than you'd think, especially in big cases where everyone wants to find someone to blame.
What about other suspects? Anyone else they were interested in?
There was a teenager, Max Fleeg. He confessed during a, get this, an unofficial polygraph test.
Wait, unofficial? How can they even use that?
They couldn't, at least not in court. Polygraph tests, especially ones not done officially, they're not very reliable. And in Fleeg's case, there was nothing else to back up his confession, so they had to let him go.
Sounds like they were struggling to find any real leads. That poor family. False confessions, dead ends. It must have been a nightmare. Was there anyone else?
They did question a guy named Silas Jane, but he had a good alibi for when the girls disappeared. He was connected to the case because he owned a stable where 2 other kids had been killed a few years before, but there was nothing directly linking him to either crime.
So a lot of dead ends, those strange things about the bodies, and an investigator who gets silenced. No wonder this is such a famous unsolved case.
It's a case full of unanswered questions. Even the frozen alive theory, where people think the girls might have been trapped somewhere and just, died from the cold, it doesn't really work. Given how cold it was and when they likely died, it's unlikely they could have survived for weeks out in the open with no clothes or shelter.
Right, that one always seemed a little far-fetched. But what about that creepy phone call their mom got, months after they died? Didn't the person on the phone say they killed the girls and even gave a detail about one of the girls' feet that wasn't public knowledge? That has to be important, right?
That phone call, it's one of the creepiest parts of this whole thing. The caller was taunting Loretta, saying he killed her daughters. And he even mentioned something about one of their feet that had never been in the news. It gave everyone chills.
Wow, that's scary. Could it have been a real lead? Did they try to trace the call or, analyze the voice?
Back then, technology wasn't what it is now. Voice analysis was just starting, and tracing calls wasn't as easy. We don't know for sure if it was the killer, someone playing a cruel joke, or just some weirdo looking for attention. It's just another unsolved part of the story.
It's frustrating, you want to believe it was a real clue, but it could just as easily have been a prank.
Exactly, just another layer of doubt in an already confusing case.
And there was another possible suspect, right? But he was never officially investigated for the Grimes case. What was up with that?
You're thinking of Charles Melquist. He was convicted in '58 for killing another young girl, Bonnie Lee Scott. And the similarities to the Grimes case, they're pretty striking. Their ages, how their bodies were found, it's definitely suspicious.
Sounds like a connection they should have investigated. Why didn't they?
Well, Melquist's lawyer wouldn't let the police question him about the Grimes sisters. So even though there are similarities, we might never know if he was involved.
Another missed opportunity, maybe. Makes you wonder if things would be different if they had looked into that. So after all these years, we're still trying to figure this out.
That's what's so powerful about these unsolved cases. They remind us that no matter how hard it is, we can't give up on searching for the truth and for justice.
It's easy to get lost in all the twists and turns, but at the end of the day, this is about 2 young girls whose lives were cut short. Their story needs to be remembered, and hopefully someday we'll have the answers.
Definitely. It's important to remember the human side of it all. Barbara and Patricia, they were daughters, sisters, friends. They had hopes and dreams, a whole future ahead of them, and it was taken away.
And what about their family? How did they cope with losing them like that?
The Grimes family, they went through so much grief, and they struggled financially after it happened. They relied a lot on their community. People rallied around them, raised money to help with expenses and keep their home.
That's really heartwarming, Even with this horrible tragedy, their community came together to support them.
Yeah, it shows how much this case affected Chicago. It really shook the city, and people wanted to help the family, maybe find some kind of closure.
It's a reminder that even in the worst times, people can come together and show kindness and support.
It is. And while the pain of their loss never really went away, the family was able to find some peace in finally laying Barbara and Patricia to rest.
So where do things stand today? Is there any chance this case will ever be solved?
Officially, it's still unsolved, but it's an open investigation. That means they can still look into new leads if they come up. And with how much forensic technology has advanced, especially DNA analysis, there's always a chance that new evidence could be found.
DNA could be huge. It's solved a lot of cold cases lately.
Mm.
What do you think? Are the odds good for this case?
Hard to say. Cold cases, they're tough to crack, but not impossible. Sometimes all it takes is one new piece of information, a fresh look at things, and the whole case opens up.
We can only hope that justice will be served for Barbara and Patricia Grimes.
And maybe their story will serve as a warning, reminding us to be careful, to protect our loved ones, and to never stop looking for answers to the mysteries that bother us.
It's a scary and heartbreaking story, and it stayed with people for decades. But it also makes you think, makes you appreciate how fragile life is and how important it is to keep fighting for justice no matter how much time has passed.
It reminds us that even when we don't have answers and it feels hopeless, we can't stop searching for the truth.
Well, thanks for taking us through this chilling and complicated case. It's been a real eye-opener, getting to the heart of a mystery that still captivates Chicago and everyone who hears about it.
My pleasure. And remember, any little piece of information, any new angle could be the key to solving this.
And for our listeners, if this deep dive has piqued your interest, go do your own research. There are tons of articles, documentaries, podcasts, online forums all about this case. You might even find something that everyone else missed.
Never underestimate the power of curiosity and a fresh pair of eyes.
Who knows, maybe one day the truth will finally come out, bringing peace to the Grimes family and closure to a city that still remembers those two young girls who disappeared on a cold December night. Until next time, keep learning, stay informed, and stay safe. It really is amazing how a case from so long ago, from 1956, can still be so powerful, so mysterious. I gotta say, I'm left wanting to know more, like wanting to see those missing pieces fall into place.
Yeah, that's what's so captivating about true crime, isn't it? It makes us curious, makes us want to understand the darker side of people, and it gives us hope that, in the end, justice wins.
Yeah, for sure. And it reminds you that this wasn't just some headline, Barbara and Patricia. They were real girls. They had families, friends, dreams for the future. It's just a chilling reminder that we're all vulnerable in a way.
It definitely shatters that feeling of safety we like to have. That idea that it can't happen here or it won't happen to me. This case, it ripped through all that for Chicago.
I bet it changed how parents raised their kids back then. Like, did you find anything about that in your research?
Oh, absolutely. The Grimes case, it had a huge impact. Parents got way more cautious, more protective of their kids. They were more aware of the dangers, even in places that seemed safe. It's a perfect example of how one event can change an entire community's sense of security.
It's a sad reminder that even in places we think are safe, there's always some risk, a reminder to be careful and to really appreciate the people we love.
You got it. And that's something that goes beyond any specific time or place. It's a truth we can all relate to no matter where we live or when we grew up.
So we've talked about so much, looked at this case from all sides, and still, officially, it's unsolved. But people haven't forgotten about it, right?
Not at all. The Grimes case still fascinates people, from amateur detectives to professional investigators. There are online forums, documentaries, articles, all dedicated to going over the evidence, exploring theories, and making sure people remember the girls.
It's like everyone's working together to find those missing puzzle pieces, to bring some closure to this awful story.
Exactly. And that's what I find so inspiring about true crime communities. They want justice, they believe even the coldest cases can be solved, and they're dedicated to remembering the victims.
If our listeners want to learn more, maybe even join the discussion, where should they start?
There's a ton of stuff online. Websites like the Doe Network and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have huge databases on cold cases, including this one. And for people who like a more hands-on approach, there are forums and subreddits about true crime. You can connect with other people and share your thoughts.
I love that. It's like crowdsourcing justice, bringing together people who really care to help solve these mysteries. So as we wrap things up, what's the one thing you want listeners to think about after this deep dive?
The most important thing to remember is that behind every unsolved mystery, there are real people, real families whose lives were changed forever. These aren't just stories for entertainment. They're tragedies that deserve our attention, our empathy, and our dedication to finding the truth.
That's a great way to put it. The Grimes sisters, Their story, it stays with you, makes you think, makes you question, makes you realize how precious life is and how important it is to never stop searching for answers.
Absolutely. And maybe by talking about these cases, by keeping them in people's minds, we can contribute to finding those answers. And maybe, just maybe, help bring some peace to those who are still waiting for justice.
Thanks for guiding us through this case. It's been really eye-opening, getting into a mystery that still has a hold on Chicago and beyond.
It was my pleasure. Remember, every little bit of information, every new way of looking at things could be what solves this.
And to everyone listening, if this got you interested, go do your own research. There are articles, documentaries, podcasts, forums, all dedicated to the Grimes case. You might even find a clue that no one else has noticed.
You never know. Don't underestimate curiosity and a fresh perspective.
And maybe someday, the truth will finally come out, giving peace to the Grimes family and closure to a city that still remembers those two girls who disappeared on that cold night in December. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and stay safe.